Number 10. The Star Child Skull. The Star Child Skull has been a spectacular mystery for decades. One main reason for this? The skull appears to have come from an alien visitor. The skull was originally found about 65 years ago in a cave slightly south of the Mexican state of Chihuahua. A teenager stumbled upon two complete skeletons while exploring the cave. One of the skeletons was completely normal, but the other was strange and looked as though it belonged to some otherworldly being. The teen apparently kept the skulls for herself and didn't pass them along until her death many years later, at which point they ended up in the hands of two American researchers named Lloyd Pye and Mark Bean. After much research, these two scientists, with the help of geneticists and other specialists in neuroscience and cranial physiology, determined that the Star Child skull contained a mix of DNA from a human and an unknown race of animal. In other words, the skull was part of some kind of freakish alien and human hybrid. Of course, the mainstream scientists want nothing to do with this bizarre skull. They won't talk about it, they won't research it, and even though there is a lot of scientific interest surrounding it, and many prestigious researchers have pored over the evidence, mainstream scientists won't touch it. This makes the skull even more mysterious. Lloyd Pye even claims that the existence of extraterrestrials visiting our planet can be substantiated because of this skull. As for the other skeleton that was discovered inside of the cave, it was probably the child's mother. It has been dated back to around 900 years, suggesting that nearly 1,000 years ago, an alien came down and mated with a human female. She then delivered a child, but for whatever reason, the alien left their bodies to rot in the Mexican cave, and similar experiments have either not been done again by aliens or have not been discovered by humans. What do you think? Are aliens secretly mating with humans? Number 9. Pointy-headed skulls. You may be familiar with the elongated skulls found throughout South America and Africa. But did you know that there have been similar skulls found in Europe? For years, researchers have been trying to figure out why there were oddly shaped skulls found in medieval burial sites concentrated in the southern region of Germany. The pointy skulls were first discovered in Bavaria in the late 1960s. There were 3 of them, each dating back to around 500 AD. The skulls had clearly been morphed, and it was thought to be through a process of binding the heads of young girls when they were infants. This created the weird pointy shape of the skulls, and while the method is pretty obvious, the exact reason behind it has been a little more confusing. Of course, skull modification was used for centuries around the world to show social status, but not heavily in Germany. This wasn't really something that happened in Bavaria. Researchers are now thinking that the pointy skulls actually belonged to brides from Bulgaria or Romania that were married off to rich or prominent members of German society about 1,500 years ago. A team of researchers from Johannes Gutenberg University analyzed 36 sets of human bones found inside 6 cemeteries, dating between the 5th and 6th centuries. 14 out of 26 female skulls showed artificial cranial deformation. DNA evidence from the male skeletons showed that they had blonde hair and blue eyes. On the other hand, the women with the deformed skulls likely had brown eyes and brown hair. This would suggest that the pale-skinned Germans were importing exotic wives with pointy heads from the Baltic region. Apparently, the Germans really fancied ladies with pointy skulls. Number 8. The Sonora aliens. When residents were digging an irrigation ditch in the Mexican state of Sonora back in 1999, they found some of the first evidence on Earth of deformed human skulls. But the evidence they found back in 1999 was some of the most disturbing of its kind. Rather than finding the deformed skulls of adults or members of high society, archaeologists discovered the burials of extremely young and otherwise healthy children with deformed skulls, suggesting that this process may have been more dangerous than scientists previously thought. Many of the skeletons were found draped in jewelry. One of them had a turtle shell placed over their chest, and others appeared to be straight-up aliens. But of course, the Sonora aliens were probably just humans with weird skulls. The practice of skull deformation was practiced by the Chinocan tribes that span the northwestern United States to the southeast United States. And there were even portraits still around that depict young children going through the process of having their skulls morphed. Out of the 25 burials found in Sonora, 17 of them were children no older than 16. According to Live Science, this suggests that whoever was turning ordinary children into adults with alien-shaped skulls was not very good at it. Sadly, most of the children died because of excessive force against their skull. Number 7. The Skull Tower of Nice. The Skull Tower in Nice, Serbia, is one of the most fascinating and yet disturbing monuments left behind during an age of barbaric warlord behavior. Hundreds of years ago, piling up the skulls of your vanquished enemies and creating giant towers of doom was apparently the thing to do. And that's exactly what happened in Nice back in 1809. The Turkish general Hirshai Pasha decapitated the Serb rebels that he defeated and then piled up their heads to create a giant Tower of Death. Today, this is the best preserved example of this savage tradition. And for those who need a bit of history reminder, 1809 was right in the middle of the first Serbian uprising against the Ottoman Empire. The small rebel army went up against a huge force of Turkish imperial guards outside the city of Nice, and they lost. Dramatically. The rebel commander actually blew up a gunpowder keg, which killed a huge number of enemy soldiers who had started flooding into their trenches, as well as the majority of his own forces. In the end, the Serbs would have lost anyway, and so at least they took a lot of Turkish soldiers with them. But, in anger, the Turkish commander took the dead bodies of the rebels, mutilated them, peeled off their skin, stuffed them with straw, and used them as building blocks for a huge tower erected beside the entrance to the city. 952 skulls were used in the construction of the Skull Tower, and when it was first made, it stood 15 feet or 4.5 meters tall. And yes, you can still see it today in Serbia, though most of the skulls are now missing. Would you like to see the Skull Tower? Or have you? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 6. The Cambridge Evidence. A mysterious skeleton was recently found near Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and it appears to be the first evidence of a Christian and pagan burial on the British Isle. The skeleton was unearthed by a British archaeological team, and she had been dated back around 1400 years. The remains are of a 16-year-old girl, buried with a garnet cross on her chest. She was also found with a leather belt, some polished rocks, and a knife. The research team believes that this girl lived between 650 and 680 AD. Nearby were 2 other skeletons, also in their teens, but whose genders have not yet been identified. Judging by the DNA evidence, researchers are confident that all 3 teenagers probably died from the plague. But here's where religion comes into play. The girl was found buried on top of her bed. Even though the wood had rotted away many years ago, the iron frame was still present. But the girl was also buried with a cross on her chest. These are 2 contradictory burial methods. Pagans would often bury the dead inside of their own beds, but Christians would bury the dead with a cross on their chest. Archaeologists are excited because this shows evidence of a slow merge from the ancient pagan ways of life to the new religion of Christianity, and it's the first of its kind ever to be found. Number 5. The Mexico City Skeleton Spiral. A strange burial site filled with bones was recently discovered under the streets of Mexico City. The bizarre skeleton pit contained 10 pairs of human remains arranged in a spiral shape with their bodies interlocked. This discovery dates back 2,400 years, and it was actually made during a recent salvage excavation beneath the Pontifical University of Mexico's campus. There hasn't been another grave found with this many bodies from the pre-classic period in Mexico City before. Archaeologists have called this spiral burial the most spectacular thing found in the region since 2006. The human bones were arranged in a circular grave about 6.5 feet or 2 meters in diameter, and there were even some grave goodies inside the pit, including ceramic jars and bowls. The 10 skeletons came from young people, males and females, and there was even an infant and a toddler included. However, the burial itself is a huge mystery. Archaeologists don't know why the bodies were buried in such a strange way, although they assume it was some kind of ritual. What ritual exactly? Nobody has any idea. Number 4. The Lovers of Medina. One of the most romantic archaeological discoveries of all time was the pair of skeletons known as the Lovers of Medina, whose corpses were discovered holding hands. The skeletons first made global headlines in 2009 when they were found in Modina's Ciro Menotti cemetery in Italy. And while at first the world assumed that the two skeletons were a heterosexual couple, recent evidence has proved they were actually both men. Researchers working with the University of Bologna tested the proteins inside of tooth enamel found in both of the skulls, and they discovered a type of peptide present only in the bodies of men. Of course, considering these men died between the 4th and 6th centuries, it is impossible to say whether they were truly lovers or not. They could have been business associates or partners in real estate. Nobody really knows, but the skeletons are still fascinating since they were found hand in hand. However, Giulia De Roca from the University of Modena has claimed the men were probably buried next to each other intentionally. Still, they could have been friends, or even just cousins. Number 3. The child and the bird skull. The mysterious bones of a child were recently found in Poland, and nobody is quite sure what they mean. The child's bones were found inside of a shallow grave in the Saspauska Valley and appeared to have been buried in the last couple hundred years, as his were the only recent human remains found in the area, meaning that the cave was not a regular location used for burials. So, the kid had likely been buried in secret, and, to make things stranger, the skull of a small bird was discovered stuffed inside the child's mouth, and another bird skull was found next to his head. Believe it or not, researchers have been trying to unravel this puzzle for the last 50 years. Despite knowing that the child was buried in the 18th century after dying at the age of 10, perhaps from malnutrition, nobody has any clue why the child was buried by itself in such a remote cave, or why a bird skull was placed inside its mouth. What do you think the reasoning behind it was? Number 2. Face down burial. Most people are buried on their backs, with their faces facing upwards. But in 2013, archaeologists discovered one of the weirdest cemeteries from the Middle Ages in Switzerland. Inside the graveyard, there was a body buried in a rather peculiar way, on its stomach rather than on its back. The skeleton belonged to a man, and he had been buried at a slight distance from the other bodies in the graveyard. There was a knife, several coins, and a coin purse found beside the body. But this is strange, because by the Middle Ages, it's believed that people were no longer being buried with grave goods in Europe. If the man had a purse on him before being buried, someone would have taken it. Even stranger is that there were 24 coins inside the purse, with almost all of them being different currencies. The man could have been a traveling merchant, but why he was buried with so much money, face down and basically alone, is still unknown. Number 1. Slaves in Lagos. In a rather horrifying discovery, the skeletons of enslaved people from the 15th century have just been found in Lagos, Portugal. The skeletons were discovered at the archaeological site of Valle de Garfia, which is located just outside the medieval walls of the ancient port city. They were found in some pretty strange conditions, with some of them even showing signs that they'd been bound at the time of burial. But what's really disturbing is that the place where they were found had been used as a dumping ground between the 15th and 17th century, and enslaved people from that time had apparently been hastily buried there with no care and no humanity. Out of the 158 skeletons found, which were identified using genetic analysis as being from southern Africa, at least half were essentially ditched in a shallow grave and then covered over. But what's fascinating about this is that the skeletons have given us a glimpse as to just how medieval Catholic Europe treated those coming from foreign lands, specifically slaves. Archaeologists from the University of Coimbra have explained that because many of those buried in the dump would have been coming from foreign lands by boat, they wouldn't have been baptized. And when they arrived in medieval Portugal and were already near death or had died on the voyage, the early Catholic people would have seen them as inhuman and unworthy of burial. And this is why so many innocent people deserving of respect ended up buried in a medieval dump. Thanks for watching. Which of these skeletal discoveries was the most bizarre to you? Let me know in the comments, and if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go.